You're thinking of this moment in the 70s when conceptual art was establishing itself in the art world. And for me, there were two issues that had to be addressed. One was if there was a crisis of representation in the art world, who did that crisis of representation affect? So for me, I didn't recognize the crisis in representation because the way I recognized the crisis of representation was in what I acknowledge as an absence of the representation of black people and black figures in artworks that I saw at the museum. So that's one kind of a crisis of representation. There's a crisis of lack. The other crisis of representation that people in what we would call the mainstream were wrestling with was the crisis of exhaustion. And the notion that representational art forms had already run their course, and that in order to be modern and then later on postmodern, one had to abandon representation in place of representation, and then align oneself with abstraction, because abstraction represented what was modern, and it represented a certain kind of freedom from what people found to be limitations in representation. I chose to embrace representation more aggressively as opposed to abandoning it, because I thought there was a problem that needed to be solved. And the problem I thought needed to be solved was that there were too few images of black people in museums and in art history books. And somebody had to do something about that. And so that was what I set myself to do. About 1980 was the moment in which I really arrived on the path that led to the kinds of works that I'm making now. Because at the time I was making some abstract collages and mixed media works. And then there was a moment I had a review. I had an exhibition, and then there was a review of the exhibition in the Los Angeles Times newspaper. And there was one line in that review that really made me wake up and recognize what the challenge was. And that line was, with these abstract collages, that they were beautifully composed, very nice colors, interesting surfaces, but they faded into masses of other things that were just like them. And that was the moment I understood that what you really had to do was to try and distinguish yourself from what everybody else was doing. And that was the moment I abandoned abstract work and went back to figuration, and I made a painting that was called The Portrait of the Artist as a Shadow of His Former Self. And that was a picture that was a black silhouette of a figure against a black background. And that's the first time I had painted a figure that was essentially black, that responded to the absence of representation with a figure that oscillated between presence and absence, where you could alternately see it sometimes and then you could not see it at other times. I mean, an extension of that work is the painting in this show called Two Invisible Men Naked. And so this is where I started to play with that idea. And from that picture and from the Two Invisible Men Naked picture, I decided to only paint my figures using black paint.